So, Zelda II, the red-headed stepchild of the Zelda series, the black sheep, if you will, a game that's not quite as talked about as the other games in the series. And personally, like Zelda 1, I had never fully played Zelda 2 prior to this video. I would try it a couple times here and there, and I would stop playing after not too long. And so, like with Zelda 1, this time around I decided to try Zelda 2 Redux, which is a similar ROM hack that has many changes and enhancements and improvements available for the game. By the way, I got a number of comments on my first Zelda video that Zelda Redux maybe makes too many changes for some people's tastes, and so they didn't really like certain things about it. But I neglected to mention in that video that the Zelda Redux ROM hacks are customizable. They have many optional patches that you can apply to game to make even further changes to things, but also to undo many of the changes that come stock with Zelda Redux. And so, as I said at the end of my Zelda 1 video, I wanted to do another playthrough of that game just for fun, and I did, and during that playthrough, I used some extra patches to make some further changes to the game, including reverting it back to be much closer to the original in certain ways. For example, I took out the diagonal sword slashing and just went with the stab that Zelda 1 normally has by default. So yeah, these ROM hacks are great. You can customize them to be exactly to your liking, and I did find my time with Zelda 1 more enjoyable when I had it a little bit closer to the original game, so there you go. You can even undo the sprite changes for people that have an issue with that. But anyway, on to Zelda 2. Yeah, this game is very, very different than your typical Zelda game. I mean, first of all, it's a side-scrolling platformer, which is very different than any other Zelda game. But also, like, it has experience points that you gain by killing enemies, which experience is not something in any other Zelda game. In fact, not having experience is one of the things I like about Zelda, but this game has it. And it also has, like, this weird overworld thing where you're walking around, and then, like, if you go off the main path, then these little enemy icons will move around, and if you encounter one of them, then you, like, go into side-scrolling gameplay, where you have, like, a battle, almost like it's a JRPG system of, like, a random encounter. You're doing the overworld gameplay, and then, you run into enemies, now we go into the alternative main style of gameplay. Like, it's so weird and so different than how any other Zelda game handles things. On top of that, you also have, with leveling up, you have your 3 main stats that you upgrade as you level up, in addition to finding heart container-esque pickups that will increase your max health and increase your max magic. You also can increase your defense and the amount of power your magical abilities have, and instead of getting new swords, you just upgrade your damage. All very weird things for Zelda that it doesn't normally do, and those are things I like about the Zelda series, and so this game not doing those things, it's very strange. Like, it feels like we're just over-complexifying the systems for no real reason. Like, you can increase your health, and that lets you take more hits. Why do we also need to have a defense stat on top of that to reduce your damage in an additional secondary way? I mean, I guess these two stats feed off of each other in a way where they combine together to be greater than each one individually, but it just feels like we're adding extra layers here unnecessarily just because. Maybe it's because they wanted to give you a motivation to kill enemies, because in Zelda 1, there was really nothing stopping you from just running past everything in that game, so this gives you some motivation to actually go out of your way to kill stuff as you make your way through the overworld and dungeons. Maybe, I guess? I don't know. Oh yeah, another weird thing Zelda 2 has is lives. That is something extremely bizarre for a Zelda game to have, but those are a thing here. Just so very, very weird how different this game is from Zelda 1. Like, they establish what Zelda is with Zelda 1, and then for the very second game, they're like, okay, throw out pretty much all of that and make a completely different game as the sequel. Which, I guess, with Zelda 1 being the only example of what a Zelda game is at this time, you could argue that Zelda 2 really isn't a betrayal of what Zelda is, because Zelda was very ill-defined at this time. Who's to say this is any less of a Zelda game than Zelda 1? There were only 2 examples of what Zelda even was at this time. Like, potentially, we could have lived in an alternate timeline where every single Zelda game was radically different than every other one, with only certain elements carrying over game to game, and that could have been the defining trait of the Zelda series. It's only because A Link to the Past went back to the Zelda 1 style and fleshed it out, and then that became the series standard, that now we look back at Zelda 2 and say that it doesn't fit with the rest of the series. But still, I do have to wonder what made them choose to make Zelda 2 so different from the first game. Like, why turn it into a side-scroller? Why add all these things? Like, what were they thinking? Why did they want to get away from the top-down, exploration-focused progression of Zelda 1? I don't know, have they ever talked about that in interviews or anything? I've never seen it anywhere. If someone knows, please do leave it down in the comments. I'd be fascinated to hear why. I mean, I do have one theory, potentially, as to at least why they may have wanted to turn it into a side-scroller, which is that, quite frankly, they've made many other side-scrollers before, and maybe they just found it easy to do something like that, because something I noticed while playing Zelda 2 is there's certain enemies in this game that is like, that's just reusing code from other Nintendo NES games. Like, this enemy right here is that's throwing all this stuff. You look at these and you're like, bro, that's a hammer, bro. Like, straight up. Not just like it's an enemy that works similarly. The way it's moving and the way it's throwing things, you can very clearly tell that is Hammer Bro code. It's probably been modified to work for this enemy type, but it's clearly reusing the same stuff. Same with these enemies here. I'm pretty sure those are things from Metroid, and like the things that jump up when you're going across the bridge, those are fucking from Mario as well. It's like, what the fuck? Why are they reusing all this code? What is this asset reusing lazy bullshit here, Nintendo? Even all the way back on the NES days, people were trying to cut corners when it comes to game development. What is this shit? Obviously, I'm just joking there, but boy was it interesting to see all this reused code from other NES games that Nintendo had made at the time. However, as much as we all like to talk about how different Zelda 2 is to the rest of the Zelda series, it also does have many similarities to Zelda 1 in numerous ways. Like, I can definitely still see how you could consider this the sequel to Zelda 1, as it does carry over many things from Zelda 1. Maybe not necessarily in the direct core gameplay, but in the general way that the game is done and the idea of what a Zelda game is, a lot of it is still here. We still have that split between the overworld gameplay and the dungeon gameplay. We still have those Metroidvania elements where you have to get items that will open up access to new areas. Dungeons are still designed in a relatively similar ideology where you have, you know, a big area you have to get through, there's a bunch of enemies that you have to fight along the way, finding keys to open doors and stuff, but things are done quite a bit differently here, as this is where we instate the whole, like, you can only use keys in the dungeon you get them in, which obviously became a series staple going forward. And in general, the bigger, higher level ideas of what Zelda is are still the same here. You have this big world that you have to explore, and you have to complete all of the dungeons in order to beat the game. You know, that's still very similar to what they were doing in Zelda 1. Just the execution of those core concepts are quite a bit different here. And as far as the side-scrolling stuff in this game goes, I'm a bit torn on how I feel about it. On one hand, I kind of like the combat of Zelda 2. I think it's pretty neat that you have that high-low combat where enemies can attack high or low and they can block high or low, but you can also do the same. And so it's about blocking the enemy attacks in the right position, but also trying to get around their guard in order to hit them at the same time. That's pretty cool. That kind of works decently well, and it kind of simulates real swordsmanship a little bit, in some ways better than even modern games manage to do. This is like one of the only games I can think of where you're able to block and attack at the same time. For whatever reason, you just can't do that in any video game when you most certainly can in a real sword fight. And it starts to get extra cool when you start fighting like the enemies that like they throw boomerangs around behind you, and so you have to try to block not just up or down, but also left and right, and then they're doing setups where they throw something behind you and then they throw something in front of you, and you have to like make sure you're blocking all these different things coming at you from different directions all at once. And it's like, hey, this combat actually kind of works. It's kind of cool. Until you eventually realize the power of just doing jump attacks all over the place, and then that kind of destroys some of the intention of the gameplay. But overall, I think the combat here is pretty neat for something so primitive and simple. it's fairly fun. The game does still have a problem with the random nature of enemy behavior. Like, when you go to attack an enemy high or low, there's really nothing you can do about them blocking. They're either gonna block or not, and there's no way to, like, attack low in order to get them to block low and then attack high. They're just gonna randomly block your attacks until they eventually randomly don't block your attack, which is kind of annoying. And the way they attack is also random, and so it can kind of be somewhat of an issue sometimes. Yeah. Still not a fan of the random enemy behavior in these games for the most part. But while overall I would say that the combat in this game is okay, the exploration parts of Zelda I think particularly suffer during the side-scrolling sections of this game, because as far as the platforming in this game goes, it's very, very limited and basic. They don't do a whole lot of it. They don't have, like, these bigger areas with lots of branching paths like you would see in a Metroid game. Generally, rooms are mostly small and flat, and you kind of just go from one end of the room to the other, and you might have a little bit of platforming you have to do in order to go there, but it's nothing that you would see from, like, an actual dedicated platformer. It's really, really basic stuff, and so you don't have nearly as much in terms of, like, ways to go when you're just going around the dungeons in these 2D sections. It's like you can go left and you can go right, and occasionally there'll be elevators, which significantly limits the just variety in terms of exploration and where you can go, what you can find, what you can do, just for getting around and stuff, and that's not really very good. Like, everything in this game feels very, very samey. It's very hard to identify one room from another in the same dungeon because everything looks the same, everything feels the same. You're like, I don't know, have I been in this elevator before? Maybe, I think. You just have to keep everything in your mind and just try to memorize the layout because you really don't have good visual landmarks to figure everything out. And you don't have good, like, layout things to help you remember stuff because everything is just flat rooms that you just get to the end of. I think this whole system probably would have worked better if instead the level design was more like that of a Metroid, where it had much more interesting and varied platforming that you were doing, and all the different areas felt more different from each other. That would probably help quite a bit, but, you know, this is just an NES game. It's very primitive, it's very simple. I understand the limitations here, but that doesn't stop these from being problems that the game does suffer from. And as far as outside the dungeon stuff goes, I gotta say, I really don't like having this weird overworld zoomed out map thing, and then we, like, zoom in for, like, the actual gameplay encounters. That is just so weird to me and so un-Zelda in so many ways, and it results in even further of that limited exploration stuff. Because when you are exploring around, there's no gameplay here. You can't do anything other than just walk around. And the map itself, I mean, it's okay. It's kind of interesting comparing it to the map of Zelda 1, because Zelda 1 was very open, and you could pretty much go anywhere you wanted, minus certain areas here and there where you needed to figure out what to do or get certain items, but generally things were very, very open, and you could go wherever you wanted for the most part. But here in Zelda 2, it's much, much more limited and locked down, and the map opens up much more through getting various items. At the start of the game, you can hardly go anywhere. You have to get a lot of stuff in order to open more and more of the game. It definitely feels much more like a Metroidvania in the sense of always hitting these dead ends that you're going to have to come back to, which is probably better for having a more digestible and understandable game. Like, I definitely did not have a problem of wandering around for like 20 minutes not knowing what the hell I'm supposed to do like I did at the beginning of Zelda 1. But, you know, that kind of freedom to go anywhere and do whatever you want is also cool, and so this is kind of like up to opinion kind of thing. Is it better that the game is more guided, or is it worse? It's really up to the person. I'm kind of fine with either execution, so that's perfectly fine here. But what's not fine is how many instances this game has stuff where there is just absolutely nothing in the game pointing you toward what the next thing you're supposed to do is. Generally, the game is pretty digestible and understandable where you can figure out what you're supposed to do next for the most part without that much issue. You know, a lot of times you can talk to NPCs and they'll give you hints, or sometimes it's just, you know, there's only one area you can go, and so naturally that's what you have to do. And then you get the item that opens up the thing you saw before, and obviously that's where you're supposed to go next, and so on and so forth, and that's fine. But also, there are a couple of instances in the game where what you have to do is just like fucking random. I got to this part in the game and I had no idea where to go, what to do. I checked all the towns and talked with all the NPCs and looked in all the different areas and caves and everything. And I was just wandering around going like, I don't understand what I'm supposed to be doing next. What am I missing? And then I discover that the next thing I'm supposed to do, obviously, is to walk around in the forest randomly until randomly one tile that is completely indistinguishable from every other tile, it turns out that there's a house here with a guy I'm supposed to talk to, and then he gives me the directions of the next thing I'm supposed to do. I'm sorry, what the fuck? What is this? How is that okay to just expect a player to randomly walk around on every single square of the overworld until they just happen to stumble upon the thing they're supposed to do next? What the fuck is that? That is such trash. And there's a couple of things like this in the game where there's just nothing. Like there's a fucking collectible over here and there's nothing that tells you that. You're just supposed to randomly walk onto this tile and, oh, I guess there's something here. Like, what? No, don't do shit like this. This is awful. Like, is the intended gameplay that the player is supposed to do here to just sweep across the map, making sure they walk along every single tile of the whole thing? Because if that's the intention, then that fucking sucks. And because the game has stuff like this, I found myself fairly frequently referring to a walkthrough because what the fuck is this crap? How the hell am I supposed to know what I'm supposed to do next a lot of the time? So yeah, the overworld stuff in Zelda 2 I think is pretty weak. I really don't like it very much overall. Like, it's okay having the map and then, you know, you see areas that you get access to as you get further into the game. And then you can go back and be like, yes, I finally have that thing I need. Now I can go check out what that was. And, you know, that sense of discovery, you know, it's classic Metroidvania stuff, and that's always satisfying to a degree. But the version of it that exists in this game is probably the weakest that it's ever been in any Zelda game, or generally in most games I've played. I will say I do like the towns. I like that there's towns now with NPCs you can talk to and they'll give you hints. Much better than fucking Zelda 1 where people are just in fucking caves and you have to pay them to fucking tell you what to do. Arbitrary random amounts. Like, that was fucking stupid. This makes a lot more sense. Makes it feel like this is an actual world that people exist and live in, as opposed to Zelda 1 that just feels like video game landia, you know what I mean? And by the way, one thing I found very interesting and weird about Zelda 2 is the items in the game and how they work, because items aren't really much of a thing in Zelda 2 in the way that they are in the other Zelda games. Because the items that you get in the dungeon, almost all of them, in fact I think every single one, is a passive item that you don't actually use. They just have some kind of effect that allow you to get to new areas, or maybe they'll be something that you use in the overworld, but they're not actually like gameplay impacting things that you're gonna use when you're in the side-scrolling core gameplay of the game, as opposed to the items in every other Zelda game, where not only do they open up new areas, but they also do let you do new things in the gameplay. Zelda 2 does not work like that. They're pretty much just progression items. They're just like keys to open up locked doors, which is very, very strange, and instead, the core gameplay variety in Zelda 2 is done through magic, which is very different than many other Zelda games. You know, going forward, Zelda games start to have magic meters with spells and stuff you can do, but most of the time, the magic is like a very, very minor aspect of the game that you don't really use very much. But here in Zelda 2, magic is like the linchpin of the core gameplay, and managing your magic meter is very, very important, which I kind of like because that's something that you don't really have to worry about very much in any other Zelda game. Like, you have the magic meter, but it really doesn't fucking matter. Here, it matters, and you really need to make sure you're paying attention to it and using it properly, and I thought that was pretty cool. However, that does also open up the possibility of you running out of magic when you need it, and then you can't progress through the dungeon anymore, and so you have to grind for enemies until you get a magic drop, and, you know, that's never good. So, you know, it's kind of a good thing and a bad thing to rely on magic so much in this game. Like, it's probably a system that could have used some ironing out, but I like that this game has a magic system that actually matters, as opposed to many other Zelda games where it really doesn't fucking matter for the most part. And, you know, looking at the magic meter and trying to think about about the decision-making there of, like, is it a good time to heal? Do I have enough magic for it? Should I save it for something else? You know, there's a tough enemy encounter here. I should probably use the magic defense spell, but you don't want to use that too much because that's going to drain your magic and stuff like that. I thought that was pretty cool and definitely had some potential to work pretty well. Also weird is that this game doesn't have a currency system. There are no rupees in this entire game, which is pretty weird for Zelda, but honestly, I don't really think the game suffers for it very much. As I said in my Zelda 1 video, I think that money didn't really add very much of positive to the game, and so I think that getting rid of it actually kind of is an improvement to the game, but it's also kind of nullified by the fact that the game has now introduced an XP system, which introduces many of those, like, grinding problems that games with these kinds of systems can have, but at the very least, there's nothing progression tied to the experience system, so you can just kind of ignore it and just play through the game, and, you know, it just levels you up and makes you more powerful passively over the course of the game. That's what I did. I really didn't care very much about my level or experience. I just, you know, played through the game, and I would level up sometimes, and it was like, cool, and that was pretty much it. So, overall, my thoughts playing through Zelda 2 was that it's a very odd game for this to be a Zelda game because it is so different than everything else, but it was also kind of interesting to see how similar it is to Zelda 1, and how it does still kind of feel very true to a Zelda game in a number of ways, but then it's also different in a number of ways. There are some things that the game does well, and some things that the game does poorly. I would definitely say that Zelda 1 is a better game than this, but during my playthrough of Zelda 2, I wasn't having a bad time with it for the most part. I was enjoying the game relatively, exploring, going through, killing enemies, doing the dungeons, you know, doing all this stuff. It was pretty alright. I was enjoying myself for a while, but eventually the game did start to wear thin on me, and I started to really notice a significant problem with the game that kind of killed it for me completely, which is that the game is fucking boring. It is so agonizingly boring. Because 90% of the playtime of this game is walking. Walking, 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 and more walking. That is all you fucking do in this game, is just walk from point A to point B. Whether that be in the overworld, and there's no gameplay here other than just walking around, and so that's boring. And then even if something does happen in the overworld, you know, you run into enemies, these are a total waste of time because it's like completely detached from your progression of trying to get to where you're going to. So it's really not worth it to fight the enemies. Most of the time, the best thing to do is to just get to the end of the screen so you can get back to walking, which means walking some more to get around the enemies and finish this encounter. And then you're in the dungeons, and guess what you do? A lot of fucking walking from one side of the room to the other. So many fucking rooms in this game are so ridiculously, unnecessarily long, and you just spend huge swaths of time just walking to the end of a room or across a bridge or whatever. And yeah, you'll encounter enemies and stuff, but that is so heavily outweighed by the amount of time you spend just walking. The towns are the same thing. They're these giant horizontal things that you just have to span across very slowly just to have, like, one little interaction with an NPC in order to get a spell or whatever. Like, why is this so gigantic with all of this pointless dead space here? It fucking sucks. This comes back to what I was talking about before, how, like, the side-scrolling elements of the game, it's not really much of a platformer like it would be in a typical 2D Metroidvania. It's really very flat and boring. You just go forward and walk and sometimes kill an enemy along the way, and it's terrible. And even though I found, like, the general dungeon gameplay and combat relatively enjoyable, eventually I just started to get so bored with all the fucking walking that even that I stopped enjoying as well, because I was so disengaged with the game at that point. And, you know, eventually it got to a point where I would just walk past enemies and walk past everything, and I was just like, the entire game just became moving across the screen, and that's all you're fucking doing, and it's fucking agonizingly, miserably boring and uninteresting. I'm not too familiar with what the general consensus on this game is, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of people aren't really big fans of it, and the main criticism I usually hear for the game is that it's very, very difficult, but the challenge of the game wasn't really very much of an issue for me. I felt that it was tough, but, you know, in a fun kind of way, but for me, the problem is just how fucking dull the game is. Oh, God, man. In fact, to be honest, it got so bad and I was having so little fun playing Zelda 2, like I was actually suffering toward the end of this game, just agonizingly, desperately wanting it to just be fucking over so I could stop playing this boring game, that I just stopped. I did not finish the game. I got to the last dungeon and I was going through it, bored out of my fucking mind. And then I was like, you know what? I'm done. Fuck this. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not having fun, and I play games to have fun. This isn't fun. This game fucking sucks. I'm sorry I did not beat the game before reviewing it, but I just couldn't, man. I just could not keep playing this game. And, like, really, I think that's a very valuable thing to say in a review, that I was not enjoying the game so much that I couldn't even be bothered to beat it. Like, straight up, this is probably one of the worst games I've played in a very long time. You know, there are bad games or games that aren't just that particularly good and you play them and you're like, ugh, this is kind of bad. But then there are bad games that, like, are so bad that eventually it turns into suffering, where playing it doesn't just not produce fun, but it produces misery in the player, and that's what this game was doing for me. The last time I had an experience like that was when I played Uncharted 1. That game fucking sucks, by the way. But Zelda 2, not only do I think of it as the black sheep of the Zelda series, now I look at this game as one of the very few games in my life that I have played that I absolutely hate. And I can say with 100% certainty, I am never going to be touching this game ever again in my entire life. Wow, this game sucks. So, I guess we have broken the Zelda was always good name of this series, but fortunately, the rest of the series does not have the same problems that this game does, so we can just kind of all pretend that this game doesn't exist, and I think we'd all be better off for it. Thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed, because I certainly didn't. I'll see you next time.